Pearl Harbor, July 24, 1943, and Rear Admiral Charles Lockwood, commander of the Pacific Submarine Force, stands on the pier, watching Lieutenant Commander Dan Daspit climb down from USS Tenosa with a look on his face that every submarine commander dreads. Empty-handed, no victory pennants flying, no kill marks to paint on the conning tower, just fury barely contained beneath a veneer of military discipline. Daspit has just returned from what should have been the most successful patrol of his career, having encountered the Tonen Maru No. 3, a 19th and 250-ton Japanese tanker, the largest in the Imperial fleet. A target so valuable that sinking it would have earned him the Navy Cross and a hero's welcome. Instead, he brings back only frustration, confusion, and one remaining torpedo that he refused to fire. What Lockwood cannot possibly know as Daspit approaches, jaw clenched and fists balled, is that this moment represents the beginning of the end for one of the most catastrophic weapons failures in American military history. A failure that has cost the United States Navy nearly 2 years of warfare, hundreds of missed opportunities, dozens of sunken submarines whose crews died without being able to defend themselves, and a scandal that reaches from the workshops of Pearl Harbor to the highest offices of the Bureau of Ordnance in Washington. The Mark 14 torpedo that Daspit and every other submarine commander has been forced to use since December 1941 represents everything wrong with Depression-era military procurement. Designed in 1931 when money was scarce and testing was considered an unaffordable luxury, the weapon combines a revolutionary magnetic influence exploder with depth control systems and contact detonators that were never properly tested under combat conditions. At $10,000 each, roughly the cost of a house in 1930s America, the torpedoes are too expensive to destroy in realistic testing, so the Navy uses dummy warheads that weigh far less than the actual explosives, conducts trials in water conditions completely different from the Pacific combat zone, and declares the weapon ready for service based on calculations and assumptions rather than hard evidence. The magnetic exploder, developed in absolute secrecy behind security protocols tighter than anything the Navy had ever implemented, receives exactly 2 live fire tests before being declared operational. 2 shots, in a weapon system that will be expected to perform thousands of times in the most crucial naval war in American history. Lieutenant Commander Daspit's patrol report, which Lockwood reads with growing horror in his office while Daspit stands rigid with barely suppressed rage, tells a story that has become sickeningly familiar to submarine commanders throughout the Pacific. On the morning of July 24th, operating in waters between Borneo and Truk, Tenosa detected Tonen Maru making 10 knots on a predictable course. Daspit manoeuvred his submarine into perfect firing position and launched 4 Mark 14 torpedoes at a range of 1,000 yards. The sonarman reported 4 distinct impacts, the unmistakable sound of metal striking metal, but no explosions, nothing. The tanker, alerted to the attack, increased speed and turned away. Daspit, refusing to accept defeat, chased the target through the night, finally catching up the next morning. This time he double-checked every torpedo personally, ensuring the magnetic exploders were disabled as Admiral Nimitz had recently ordered. He fired 2 more torpedoes from an oblique angle. Both hit. Both exploded. The tanker stopped dead in the water, listing to port, settling by the stern, a sitting duck. What happens next becomes the most documented torpedo failure of World War II. Daspit, taking his time because the target cannot escape, positions Tenosa at the perfect range of 875 yards, exactly perpendicular to the tanker's beam. The textbook approach. The shot every submarine commander trains for. He fires 1 torpedo. It runs straight and true, hits the hull dead center, and produces nothing but a disappointing splash. Daspit, methodical even in his mounting fury, orders his torpedo crew to inspect every remaining fish in the submarine. The torpedo men, experts who have maintained these weapons for months, examine each torpedo minutely and report them all in perfect working order. Daspit fires again, another perfect shot, another hit, another failure, He continues firing one torpedo at a time, watching through his periscope as each weapon strikes the massive tanker exactly where aimed and does absolutely nothing. The 11th torpedo, hitting well aft on the port side, does something unprecedented. After impact, it turns 90 degrees, leaps completely out of the water about 100 feet from the tanker's stern, and sinks. Daspit will later write in his patrol report that he finds it hard to convince himself that he actually saw this happen. By the time a Japanese destroyer arrives forcing Tenosa to break off the attack, Daspit has fired 15 torpedoes at Tonan Maru. Exactly 2 exploded, both fired at oblique angles during the initial attack. The remaining 13, fired under perfect perpendicular conditions at a stationary target, all failed despite hitting their target. Daspit, demonstrating the kind of clear thinking that separates good commanders from great ones, makes a decision that will change the course of the Pacific War. He keeps his 16th and final torpedo unfired, preserving it as evidence. He surfaces, sends a contact report, and when ordered to return to Pearl Harbor, he complies immediately, determined to prove once and for all that the problem lies not with submarine commanders or their crews, but with the torpedoes themselves. The greeting Lockwood gives Daspit on the pier reflects a relationship built on mutual respect and shared frustration. Lockwood, unlike many admirals who achieve high rank through political, manoeuvring and careful avoidance of controversy, is a career submariner who has commanded boats himself and who trusts his commanders implicitly. When Daspit storms into his office, Lockwood expects a torrent of profanity damning everyone from the Bureau of Ordnance to the Newport torpedo station. Instead, Daspit is almost speechless with fury, able only to describe what happened in flat, emotionless terms that somehow convey his rage more effectively than any cursing could. 19,000-ton tankers don't grow on trees, Lockwood thinks, and here stands a commander who had one dead in the water and couldn't sink it with 11 perfect shots. The torpedo that Daspit brings back receives the standard comprehensive inspection at the Pearl Harbor torpedo shop, and the technicians render the same verdict that has been repeated hundreds of times throughout the war. The weapon is in perfect working order, no defects found, operates exactly as designed. This conclusion, which should provide some comfort, instead confirms Lockwood's worst suspicions. If the torpedo works perfectly according to Navy specifications, and if it fails completely under combat conditions, then the Navy specifications themselves must be fatally flawed. The problem is not maintenance or handling or commander error, as the Bureau of Ordnance has repeatedly insisted. The problem is fundamental design defects that were never discovered because nobody wanted to spend money on realistic testing. Admiral Charles Lockwood is exactly the right man in exactly the right place at exactly the right time to fix this disaster. Many flag officers, confronted with a problem this politically charged, would temporize and defer to Washington, protecting their careers and avoiding confrontation with powerful bureaucracies. Lockwood, known throughout the submarine force as Uncle Charlie for his habit of personally greeting returning boats and his genuine concern for his crews, chooses instead to take personal action regardless of the consequences to his career. He understands that every day this problem continues, American submarines are dying without being able to fight back effectively, Japanese convoys are sailing unmolested, and the Pacific War is being prolonged at the cost of American lives. The Bureau of Ordnance, safely distant in Washington and deeply invested in defending weapons they designed, can be ignored or circumvented. The submarine commanders and their crews, dying in waters 6,000 miles from home, cannot be. Lockwood turns to Captain Charles Swede Mommsen, commander of Submarine Squadron 2, for help. Mommsen represents everything the Navy bureaucracy simultaneously admires and fears. Famous for inventing the Mommsen lung that allowed submarine crew to escape from sunken boats, and for leading the rescue of 33 survivors from USS Squalus in 1939. Mommsen has a reputation as a brilliant innovator and a man who speaks his mind regardless of political consequences. His habit of challenging senior officers and proposing unorthodox solutions has earned him few friends in Washington, but complete loyalty from submarine crews who know he fights for them. When Lockwood explains the Tenosa incident and asks what can be done, Mommsen's response is immediate and practical. Stop asking Washington for permission. Stop waiting for the Bureau of Ordnance to conduct studies and issue reports. Take some torpedoes, fire them at something solid under conditions that replicate combat, and find out exactly what's going wrong. Mommsen spends days studying charts of Hawaiian waters looking for the perfect test location, and he finds it at Kahulawai, a small island where sheer vertical cliffs drop straight into deep water with a sandy bottom. The cliffs provide a solid target that will definitively show where the contact exploders work. The deep water allows for recovery of any dud torpedoes. The location is close enough to Pearl Harbor that tests can be conducted quickly and repeatedly. Lockwood, recognizing the brilliance of the plan, immediately approves it and assigns the submarine Muskellunge to conduct the tests beginning on August 31st, 1943. The plan is simple. Load inspected torpedoes, including Daspit's remaining fish from Tenosa, into Muskellunge, fire them at the cliffs at 90-degree angles, replicating the perfect perpendicular shots that keep failing in combat. Recover any duds and examine them to discover the problem. The first test shot on August 31st runs true and explodes against the cliff exactly as designed. Celebration on Muskellunge is premature. The second torpedo hits the cliff and produces the familiar geyser of compressed air and water that submarine commanders throughout the Pacific have learned to dread. A dud. The torpedo sinks to the bottom in 50 feet of water, its 685-pound warhead of high explosives still very much capable of detonating if disturbed. Any normal salvage operation would involve careful remote handling by experienced divers using specialized equipment. Mommsen, demonstrating either extraordinary courage or complete insanity depending on one's perspective, simply grabs his snorkel gear and jumps into the water. He locates the live torpedo on the sandy bottom, personally supervises its attachment to lifting lines, and watches as it's carefully hoisted onto the deck of the service ship Widgeon, where it rests like a deadly metal cigar, capable of exploding at the slightest mishap. What happens next becomes legend in the submarine community. Mommsen, without any special protective equipment and surrounded by sailors who have very sensibly moved to the far end of the ship, begins disassembling the Mark VI exploder mechanism. The work requires steady hands and complete understanding of the device's internal mechanisms, because one wrong move could trigger the 685 pounds of Torpex explosive and vaporize everyone within 100 yards. Mommsen, calm as if he's changing a car tyre, methodically removes components until he can examine the firing pin mechanism. What he discovers changes everything. The firing pin, supposed to strike the primer cap with enough force to detonate the warhead, has indeed been released by the impact, but the guide pins that direct it into the primer caps are severely bent and deformed. The firing pin never struck with enough force because the inertial impact of hitting at high speed crushed the guides and prevented proper function. The faster the torpedo travelled and the more perpendicular the impact, the worse the problem became, which explained why oblique angle shots sometimes worked, while perfect perpendicular shots consistently failed. The solution, once the problem is identified, proves almost embarrassingly simple. The firing pin assembly is made of heavy steel, and when a 3,000-pound torpedo strikes a target at 46 knots, the inertial forces are enormous. The pins simply cannot move fast enough through the guides before they deform under the impact stress. Mommsen and his team, not waiting for Washington's approval or additional studies, begin testing alternative designs. They discover that making the firing pin assembly from lightweight aluminum instead of steel reduces the inertial forces to manageable levels. Even better, aluminum salvage from the propellers of Japanese aircraft shot down during the Pearl Harbor attack provides exactly the right properties. The workshops at Pearl Harbor, every machine shop working around the clock, begin producing new lightweight firing pins and retrofitting them into existing exploders. By September 1943, the first modified torpedoes are ready for testing. The final proof comes when submarine halibut, loaded with modified torpedoes, returns to Kahulaway to repeat Momsen's tests. 7 torpedoes are fired at the cliffs at 90-degree angles. 6 explode. 1 fails. The improvement from a 70% failure rate to roughly 15% represents the difference between a useless weapon and a war-winning one. But Momsen is not satisfied with 15% failures. He supervises additional tests where dummy warheads filled with sand are suspended from a crane at 90 feet height and dropped onto steel plates set at various angles. In 7 out of 10 drops, the standard firing mechanisms bend, jam and fail with the high inertia of straight-on impacts. The modified lightweight pins work reliably. By October 1943, every submarine leaving Pearl Harbor carries torpedoes with the new exploders, and the results are immediate and dramatic. But the depth control problem persists. Momsen and Commander Art Taylor, Lockwood's gunnery and torpedo officer, conduct additional tests firing torpedoes through a series of evenly spaced nets yet submerged at known depths. The results are shocking. The Mark 14 torpedoes are not just running deeper than set, they're wobbling through the water like a sine wave. Alternately deep and shallow, their actual depth at any given moment basically a matter of luck. This problem cannot be fixed at Pearl Harbor. It requires redesigning the depth control mechanism itself, relocating the pressure sensing port from the nose where water flow creates measurement errors to the mid-body, where hydrostatic pressure is accurate. This modification, eventually implemented throughout the fleet, completes the transformation of the Mark 14 from a fundamentally broken weapon into one of the most effective torpedoes of World War II. The human cost of the nearly 2-year delay in fixing these problems can never be fully calculated. American submarines, constituting only 2% of Navy personnel, ultimately sink 55% of all Japanese shipping lost during the war, accounting for over 5 million tons of enemy vessels. But this success comes almost entirely after October 1943, when reliable torpedoes finally reach the fleet. Before that date, submarine commanders fire thousands of torpedoes that run too deep, explode prematurely, or fail to detonate on impact. Japanese merchant ships arrive in port with unexploded American torpedoes embedded in their hulls. Japanese naval officers report to their superiors that American submarine attacks are ineffective and poorly executed, never realizing they're being saved by defective American weapons rather than Japanese defensive skill. American submarine commanders, knowing they face depth charges and probable death if detected, endure the psychological torture of achieving perfect firing solutions and watching their torpedoes fail. Some commanders are relieved of duty. Their careers ended because their superiors believe they lack aggression or skill, when in reality they're simply victims of weapons that don't work. The Bureau of Ordnance's response to the mounting evidence of torpedo failures represents institutional denial at its absolute worst. Despite receiving hundreds of failure reports from the operating forces, Buord consistently blames submarine commanders for bad approaches, improper maintenance, and lack of aggressive spirit. When Admiral Lockwood flies to Washington in summer 1943 to personally confront Buord officials with evidence from his commanders, he's met with hostility and accusations that he's trying to discredit the Bureau. Only intervention by Chief of Naval Operations Admiral Ernest King, forced to act because the failure reports can no longer be ignored, finally compels Buord to acknowledge problems and authorize fixes. Even then, Buord insists on conducting their own tests and issuing their own modifications rather than adopting the field expedient solutions that Lockwood and Momsen have already proven effective. The irony of the situation is that Newport Torpedo Station had discovered the firing pin problem in the 1930s during pre-war testing. When they flung test torpedoes against steel plates mounted over sand, they found that firing pins failed to strike primer caps with sufficient force at impact speeds. Their solution was to strengthen the spring that drives the firing pin, which worked adequately at the slower speeds of 1930s-era torpedoes. But by World War II, torpedo speeds had increased to 46 knots, and the higher impact forces overwhelmed even the strengthened springs. Nobody thought to retest the mechanism at modern speeds. Nobody wanted to destroy expensive torpedoes to verify that old assumptions still held true. The result was sending men into combat with weapons that had a known flaw that was never fixed because testing cost money. The Mark 14 torpedo saga illustrates fundamental problems that plague military procurement across all nations and all eras. Complex weapons cannot be properly tested without expending them under realistic combat conditions, but realistic testing is expensive and politically difficult. Design teams become emotionally invested in their creations and resist admitting flaws. Distant bureaucracies dismiss reports from the field because accepting them requires acknowledging institutional failure. Career advancement depends on supporting established positions rather than admitting mistakes. Only when the body count becomes undeniable, and when commanders like Lockwood and Mommsen are willing to risk their careers by conducting unauthorized tests, do problems get fixed. The German Navy experienced virtually identical torpedo failures in the early war years, also caused by depth control problems and contact exploder failures. Unlike the American response, which took nearly 2 years, German leadership court-martialed 4 senior officers for the failures, focused minds wonderfully, and fixes were implemented quickly. Admiral Lockwood's demand at a wartime conference in Washington perfectly captures the frustration of submarine commanders throughout the Pacific. If the Bureau of Ordnance cannot provide us with torpedoes that will hit and explode, he tells senior Navy officials, then for God's sake get the Bureau of Ships to design a boat hook with which we can rip the plates off a target's side. The comment, delivered with cutting sarcasm to men whose decisions have cost American lives, makes Lockwood no friends in Washington, but cements his reputation among submarine crews as a leader who fights for them regardless of personal consequences. When he finally confronts his old friend Rear Admiral Spike Blandy, Chief of the Bureau of Ordnance, Blandy angrily accuses him of deliberately trying to discredit Buord. Lockwood's response is simple and devastating. He's not trying to discredit anyone. He's trying to give his submarine commanders weapons that work so they can stop dying uselessly and start sinking Japanese ships. The transformation of submarine warfare after October 1943, when reliable torpedoes finally reached the fleet, proves what American submarines could have accomplished from the war's beginning if they had been properly equipped. Sinkings increase dramatically, Japanese convoy operations have become suicidal. Island garrisons starve because supplies cannot reach them. Japanese oil tankers are destroyed faster than they can be replaced. The merchant marine losses become unsustainable, crippling Japanese industry and military operations. By war's end, American submarines have sunk over 2,700 Japanese vessels totaling nearly 10 million tons, a feat of maritime destruction unprecedented in naval history. All of it accomplished primarily in the final 2 years of war, after the torpedo problems are fixed. Lieutenant Commander Daspit, whose patrol on Tinosa sparked the final resolution of the torpedo scandal, receives his Navy Cross and continues commanding submarines throughout the war. His decision to preserve that final torpedo as evidence and his willingness to confront senior leadership about systemic failures represents exactly the kind of moral courage the Navy depends on but doesn't always reward. Captain Mommsen receives the Legion of Merit for his work fixing the torpedo problems, though the citation carefully avoids mentioning that he achieved success by ignoring Washington and diving on live explosives in Hawaiian waters. His methods would never be approved by any modern safety review board, but they got results when nothing else would. The Mark 14 torpedo eventually becomes one of the most successful weapons in American naval history, remaining in service until 1980 and sinking more enemy tonnage than any other submarine weapon of World War II. But this success comes only after field expedient fixes conducted by commanders who refuse to accept bureaucratic excuses for failed weapons. The Great Torpedo Scandal of 41 to 43 serves as an enduring reminder that even the most technically advanced military can fail catastrophically when institutional pride overrides operational reality, when cost considerations trump realistic testing, and when distant decision-makers dismiss reports from those who actually fight. The solution, when it finally comes, arrives not from extensive studies or careful bureaucratic reviews, but from one mad admiral willing to risk his career and one brilliant engineer willing to dive on live explosives to prove what submarine commanders had been reporting for 18 months. The weapons were defective, the commanders were right, and fixing the problem required nothing more complicated than listening to the men who were actually fighting the war.